The envelope hit the white tablecloth like a slap. $20,000, the man across from me said. Take it, disappear. Tell everyone your health is failing and you're moving to Florida. Never come near my son's wife again. They thought I was a broke old man in a thrift store jacket. But to understand exactly how far they fell, you have to go back to the beginning. Before we go there, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe that arrogance always comes with a bill attached, the wind off Lake Michigan does not care who you are. It cuts through cheap coats and expensive ones exactly the same way. I stood on the sidewalk outside one of the most expensive steakhouses in the city, watching valets in crisp black vests jog back and forth, opening the doors of cars that cost more than most people's houses. Men stepped out of those cars in suits that had never seen a wrinkle. Women stepped out in heels that had never touched a cracked sidewalk. Nobody looked at me twice. I looked down at my boots. Old leather, scuffed at the toes, polished carefully anyway, because a man should always take care of what he has, even if what he has is old. I had owned those boots for 15 years. I could have walked into that restaurant, bought the building outright with one phone call, and walked back out owning the block. Instead, I had parked my beat-up pickup truck 3 streets away, in a spot where the doorman wouldn't have to grimace at it, and I had walked the rest of the way in the cold. People assume that a rich man wants to be seen. In my experience, it's the opposite. A rich man who wants respect he hasn't earned needs to be seen. Rachel was the reason I was standing there at all, freezing, waiting to walk into a dinner I already knew would be unpleasant. She had married a man named Sean 3 years earlier, and from the very first handshake, I had seen exactly what he was. I want to be fair here, because a father's judgment about the man his daughter marries is never perfectly clean. But I had spent 40 years reading men across negotiating tables, men who wanted something from me and were trying very hard to hide it. He was polite to me, the way you're polite to a stranger holding a door, brief, automatic, and completely forgettable. Underneath the politeness was something colder, a kind of tired, put-upon tolerance, like I was an inconvenient piece of furniture that had come along with the marriage and could not, unfortunately, be returned. He believed, because I had let him believe it, that I was a retired blue-collar worker getting by on a small pension. He believed my modest 2-bedroom house in the suburbs. People sometimes ask me why. Why would a father let his daughter's husband believe he married into nothing when the truth was so different? The answer is simple, even if living it out was not. So when Sean told me, with the heavy sigh of a man performing an obligation rather than extending an invitation, that his parents were flying in to celebrate his new promotion to CEO of a company called Apex Innovations, and that I was invited to the dinner, I said yes immediately. I said yes because I needed to see with my own eyes exactly what kind of family my daughter had married into. I had a strong suspicion already. That dinner was going to confirm it in a way I could never have predicted. I pushed open the heavy brass doors and stepped into a wave of warm air that smelled like seared beef, roasted garlic, and expensive perfume. The lobby was all dark wood and soft gold lighting, the kind of place designed to make you feel like money before you've spent $1 of your own. A hostess in a fitted black dress looked me over. It only took her a second, one quick sweep from my collar to my boots, before her professional smile tightened just slightly at the corners. She had clocked the frayed elbow of my jacket. The door to the private room was slightly open. I could hear voices inside, confident, easy, the kind of laughter that comes from people who have never once worried about a bounced check. Howard and Cynthia sat at the center of the long table, exactly the way I had pictured them. Howard wore a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it looked like it had been poured onto him, and a gold watch heavy enough to double as a paperweight. Cynthia wore a silk dress and a rope of pearls, her face arranged into the kind of tight, permanent expression that comes from years of judging other people's furniture. Nobody stood up. Nobody offered a hand. Howard and Cynthia's eyes moved over my jacket, my shirt, my shoes, and I watched their expressions curdle from polite curiosity into something closer to distaste. I walked to the chair he'd pointed at and sat down in a silence so thick it felt like something you could lean on. The moment the waiter finished pouring the water, the real evening began. Cynthia leaned forward first, resting her diamond-studded fingers on the tablecloth, and asked, with a smile that was pure condescension wrapped in sugar. I kept my voice level. I told him I'd worked with my hands my whole life. I told him I'd spent decades managing freight, moving boxes, dealing with trucks, keeping cargo on schedule. Every word of that was true. Howard let out a short, sharp laugh and glanced at Cynthia, sharing a look that said everything. a look of two people confirming to each other that they had correctly identified the help. In their minds, I had just been officially filed away uneducated. Blue collar. Cynthia wasn't finished with me yet. She asked, with an air of polite curiosity that fooled absolutely no one, whether I had ever traveled outside the country. I told them evenly that I had never needed much to relax. A cup of coffee and a quiet porch had always done the job for me. Howard actually laughed out loud at that, a short, dismissive bark, and told Cynthia that it was almost charming, in a sad kind of way, how little some people needed to be satisfied with their lives. I let the comment pass without a flicker of reaction, though I noted quietly the particular kind of cruelty it takes to look at another person's contentment and decide it must come from ignorance rather than choice. Sean shifted in his seat. The room kept tightening. Every comment Cynthia made about fine dining, about their club memberships, about the right kind of social circles, was another small, deliberate cut, another brick laid in a wall meant to remind me exactly where I stood beneath them. I didn't defend myself. I didn't raise my voice. I sat there quietly, drinking my tap water, watching their arrogance unfold with the calm, patient attention of a man who has seen this exact performance 100 times before, in 100 different boardrooms, from 100 different men who thought their money made them untouchable. When the food arrived, thick cuts of steak, delicate towers of seafood, more food than the table could reasonably eat, Howard didn't touch his plate. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick, crisp white envelope. He set it on the table, pressed 2 fingers against it, and slid it slowly across the polished wood until it stopped directly in front of my plate. The room went completely silent. Sean stared down at his food, like it had suddenly become the most interesting thing he had ever seen. I looked at the envelope. Then I looked up at Howard. "What is this?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. He didn't even try to soften it. "There's a cashier's check inside," he said. $20,000. Call it a relocation fund." Howard leaned back in his chair, satisfied, as if he had just made a very reasonable business proposal. He explained the terms with brutal, almost bored precision. I was to invent some excuse, failing health maybe, or a sudden craving for warmer weather. I felt my heart beat once, hard, against my ribs, not from fear. "Why?" I asked quietly. "Would I ever do that?" I did not touch the envelope. I turned my head slowly and looked at Sean, the boy, because in that moment, despite being a grown man with a corner office, that's exactly what he looked like to me. I had allowed to marry my only daughter. The man who had stood in front of family and friends and promised out loud to honor and protect her. "Do you agree with your father?" I asked him directly. For a moment, Sean didn't answer. "Yes," he said. He told me with a straight face that his career required a certain image, that a CEO running a company the size of Apex Innovations simply could not have a father-in-law who looked like a janitor standing next to him at company events. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I did. I sat in that chair for a long, silent moment, letting the full weight of what he'd just said settle into my chest. My son-in-law had just told me, to my face, in front of his parents, that he was ashamed of me and that he was willing to pay me to disappear. He had absolutely no idea that the company giving him his fancy title, the company funding the very suit he was wearing, had been built by the hands he was so casually insulting. He had no idea that the board of directors who had hired him ultimately answered to a blind trust. A trust controlled, in full, by the quiet old man sitting at the far end of the table in a faded tweed jacket. At that exact moment, the door opened, and Rachel walked back in, smiling, completely unaware of the execution that had just taken place in her absence. Before anyone could say another word, I reached out, picked up the envelope, and slid it smoothly into the inside pocket of my jacket. The mood in the room shifted instantly. Howard and Cynthia exchanged a quick, victorious glance. Sean let out a small, barely audible breath of relief. They thought I had folded. They thought the poor, humiliated old man had swallowed his pride and taken the money because deep down he had nothing else. I looked at my daughter, my kind, generous, big-hearted Rachel, who deserved infinitely better than the 3 cowards sitting at that table. Anger, I have learned over a long life, is an emotion for people who don't have any other options, and I had every option in the world. I stood up slowly. I reached into my pants pocket and pulled out a single crumpled dollar bill. I smoothed it flat between 2 fingers and set it down carefully in the center of my empty plate. I looked at Sean. Then I turned to Rachel, forcing a gentle, tired smile onto my face. I told her I wasn't feeling well, that the cold outside had given me a headache and I needed to go home and rest. As I pulled back from her, I caught one last look at Howard over her shoulder. I turned my back on all three of them and walked out. I walked through the crowded main dining room, past the clinking crystal and the wealthy laughter, and pushed through the brass doors into the freezing Chicago night. Something happened the second those doors closed behind me. The quiet, tired old man I had been playing for the last 2 hours simply vanished. My spine straightened, my shoulders pulled back, my eyes, I imagined, sharpened into something closer to the man I actually was. I reached into my jacket pocket, ignored the envelope full of Howard's dirty money, and pulled out my phone. I scrolled to a name near the top of my contacts and pressed call. "Stephen," I said before he could even finish his greeting. They took the bait. Stephen March had been my attorney for 30 years. "My son-in-law just crossed a line he can't walk back," I told him. "I want a full forensic audit on every account Sean has touched since the board named him CEO, every dime. I want it started tonight." There was a short pause on the other end, and then Stephen's voice, calm and businesslike, said only, "Understood." I stood on that dark street for a moment longer, watching the valet bring a silver sports car around to the restaurant's front entrance for some other wealthy diner, and I felt something settle deep in my chest. Not rage exactly, but its colder, more patient cousin, certainty. I already knew, standing there in the freezing wind, exactly how this story was going to end. The hunt had begun, and I intended to take their entire fraudulent little kingdom apart, brick by brick, down to the foundation. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the skyline, I drove my rusted pickup truck into the underground garage of a glass skyscraper in the financial district. I bypassed the visitor section completely. Somewhere between the lobby and the top of that building, the poor, quiet old man from last night's dinner disappeared completely. I hung my faded jacket over the back of a leather chair, sat down and rested my palms flat against the table, feeling, as I always did in that room, the full weight of my own life pressing up through the polished wood. I looked at the gold embossed logo on the top file. Apex Innovations. Sean loved throwing that name around like he had personally pulled the whole company out of the ground with his bare hands. He had no idea what it had actually taken to build it. 30 years earlier, my wife Clara had died suddenly, leaving me alone with a grieving toddler and a mountain of medical debt that felt at the time completely impossible to climb out from under. Every dollar I earned went straight back into the business. One truck became 10. 10 became 100. 10 years ago, my heart, literally, medically, could no longer handle the pace of running that company day to day. I had already secured our future many times over, so I made a decision. I would step back. 2 years ago, Sean walked into that corner office, believing he had conquered the business world entirely through his own genius. When he later married my daughter, he looked at my old boots, my modest house, my simple life, and immediately filed me away as a failure. He thought he was the undisputed king of the castle. In reality, he was a hired hand wandering blindly through a fortress I had built with my own 2 hands 30 years before he'd ever set foot in it. I don't talk about Clara much, even now, but if you want to understand why any of this mattered so much to me, you need to know a little about her. We married 2 years later in her parents' backyard, under a string of paper lanterns her mother had made by hand. We didn't have money for much of a wedding, and we didn't need one. I remember standing there thinking that whatever happened to me for the rest of my life, I had already gotten the best part of it. Rachel was born 5 years after that, on a freezing night in February, and Clara held her like she'd been waiting her whole life for exactly that moment. We were happy in the plain, unglamorous way that doesn't make for exciting stories. A small apartment, secondhand furniture, a used car that broke down more than it ran. Clara got sick when Rachel was 2. The medical bills came in waves for months afterward. I sold almost everything we owned that wasn't nailed down. I remember standing in a police auction lot on a gray October morning, counting out the last of my savings for a delivery truck with a cracked windshield and bald tires, because it was the only thing in my price range that could still run. I want to be honest about something. Building Apex Innovations was never really about ambition, not in the way people usually mean that word. It was about survival first, and then, slowly, it became about making sure my daughter never had to know the kind of fear I felt in that police auction lot, counting crumpled bills with a baby on my hip. Every hour I worked in those early years, the 20-hour days, the meals I skipped so Rachel could eat, the nights I fell asleep in the truck cab because driving home would have cost me another hour of work. I never told Rachel most of this until much later, after everything with Sean was over, but it's the reason I fought as hard as I did. People who meet Stephen for the first time usually assume he's just another expensive corporate lawyer, hired for his sharp suits and his sharper instincts. They're not wrong about the instincts, but they're missing the actual story, which matters more than most people realize. I met Stephen almost 35 years ago, back when Apex Innovations, though it didn't have that name yet, was still just me, 4 trucks, and a rented garage on the edge of town. Stephen won that case. Over the next 3 decades, Stephen turned down offers from firms that would have paid him 5 times what I could afford in the early years. I asked him once, long after the company had grown into something neither of us could have imagined in that rented garage, why he'd stayed. He told me, without much sentiment in his voice, that most lawyers spend their entire careers protecting people who don't deserve it. He said he'd rather spend his protecting someone who did. When Clara died, Stephen was one of the only people outside my own family who showed up at the funeral and then kept showing up for months afterward, quietly handling paperwork I couldn't bring myself to look at, making sure the business didn't collapse while I was barely able to get out of bed some mornings. When I decided to step back a decade ago and disappear into the blind trust, Stephen was the only person on earth who knew where the real power actually sat. So when I called him from that freezing sidewalk outside the steakhouse and told him Sean had crossed a line, I never once had to explain why it mattered or worry that he'd hesitate. I looked across the table at Stephen, who stood waiting silently for his instructions. My son-in-law made a fatal mistake, I told him. He mistook my silence for weakness. He mistook a simple life for a defeated one. He wanted to buy my absence to protect his precious image. It's time he learned exactly who owns that image. Stephen allowed himself the smallest, coldest smile I'd seen on his face in a long time. He opened his laptop and typed a short, rapid sequence of commands, and somewhere in a secure server room I would never see, a decade-long anonymity shield quietly switched off. The system chimed softly, confirming what both of us already knew. A sleeping giant had just been violently woken up by a fool who thought he was throwing stones at a ghost. But exposing my identity was only step 1. I hadn't come back just to fire Sean. Anyone with majority ownership can fire a CO. I needed to know, in exact and documented detail, what he had actually been doing behind my desk for the past 2 years. I told Stephen to pull in the accounting team. Within the hour, Stephen had transformed the private boardroom into something closer to a command center. I sat at the head of the table with a cup of bitter black coffee, watching them boot up encrypted laptops and get to work. I handed over Sean's executive authorization codes, the very codes I had secretly granted him through the blind trust 2 years earlier. The room fell into a kind of tense, focused silence, broken only by the fast clicking of keyboards. Years of financial history began to scroll across the massive wall monitor, a river of numbers that most people would find meaningless, but that I could read the way other men read a newspaper. For nearly 48 hours, I barely left that leather chair. I watched a team of strangers dissect a company I had built with my own hands from nothing but a broken truck and desperation. I remembered balancing the ledgers myself at my kitchen table in the early years, making sure every single driver got paid fairly and on time, making sure every vendor's check went out when it was promised. I had built my entire reputation on one simple principle: my word was worth something. I never once took a cent that wasn't mine. Watching Sean's name plastered across the top of executive accounts filled me with something close to nausea. He was sitting in a chair I had earned, using my company like it was his own private toy box. On the second night, the lead accountant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Valerie, stopped typing. She looked over at Stephen, then turned her monitor toward me. "We found something," she said. Valerie pulled up a tangled web of financial transfers on the main screen and began walking me through it. For the past 18 months, she explained, Sean had been systematically bypassing the board's oversight committee. Millions of dollars. Real money, corporate treasury money. I stared at the numbers glowing on that screen and felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't a man being greedy at the edges. This was a calculated, ongoing theft, executed by someone who had clearly done this kind of thing before, or at the very least, had studied exactly how to do it without getting caught. The man who had looked at me with such open disgust across a dinner table. The man who had called me a pathetic burden to his career. The accountants traced the shell companies to a set of offshore accounts controlled exclusively by Sean. He had bypassed nearly every safeguard I'd put in place a decade earlier, forging approval signatures from department heads who had no idea their names were being used, manipulating quarterly reports to hide the growing holes in the treasury. My chest tightened with a cold, controlled anger. He wasn't just stealing from a company, he was stealing the future I had built for my daughter. Stephen asked if I wanted him to call the authorities that night. He said we could have Sean arrested at his own desk by morning. I shook my head slowly. An immediate, quiet arrest felt too clean, too merciful, honestly. Sean and his parents had humiliated me in public, at a dinner table, in front of my own daughter's empty chair. I told Stephen to build a complete dossier, lock down every piece of evidence, and prepare for something bigger than a quiet resignation. That's when Valerie interrupted again. She pulled up a new set of records, and the shape of the entire scheme suddenly became much larger and much more personal. The offshore accounts, it turned out, were not the final destination for the stolen money. They were a transit point, a smokescreen. The primary beneficiaries of those trusts were Howard and Cynthia. I stared at the screen as the pieces slammed together with sickening clarity. The lavish lifestyle Howard had bragged about at dinner, the estate, the vacations, the watches, wasn't the product of decades of smart investing like he liked to imply. Valerie pulled the receipts one by one. The 3-week trip to the Amalfi Coast Howard had bragged about over his steak, the custom suits, the designer luggage, the diamonds Cynthia wore like a crown, 2 luxury cars registered in Howard's name, paid for in cash diverted from a shipping contract. Then she opened the largest file of the entire audit. 2 weeks earlier, Sean had wired $4 million out of an emergency reserve fund directly into a private holding company controlled by Cynthia. I sat there for a long moment, letting the full, absurd scale of it wash over me. I thought about that white envelope sliding across the mahogany table. I closed my eyes and forced the anger back down, letting it cool into something harder and more useful. Anger makes a man careless, and I could not afford a single mistake now. I let it settle into cold, calculated resolve. I turned to Stephen. "We're not filing a simple termination," I told him. "We're invoking federal racketeering law." Stephen's eyes lit up with something close to professional hunger. Howard and Cynthia were not innocent bystanders, ignorant of their son's sudden wealth. The financial trail proved they were active, knowing accomplices, collecting stolen corporate money through fraudulent consulting firms registered in their own names. We were not going to strike that night. I wanted to let Sean have his grand corporate merger gala this coming weekend. I wanted to let him stand under bright lights in front of the city's elite, believing he had successfully pushed the pathetic old father-in-law out of the picture for good. I wanted them at the absolute peak of their false pride. The higher they climbed, the harder the fall would be. While the accountants kept digging, I asked Valerie to pull one more thing for me, not evidence for the federal case, just something I needed to see for myself. She found it within an hour. 2 years earlier, right around the time Sean had taken over as CEO, the company had quietly cut its contribution to the driver pension fund, citing temporary budget adjustments. I asked Stephen to pull the personnel file of a driver named Marcus Delgado, a name I recognized because I had personally hired him almost 15 years earlier, back when I still knew most of our drivers by their first names. According to the records, Marcus had planned to retire the following year. I sat with that for a long time. I think about Marcus sometimes, even now. 2 days later, I was kneeling in my front yard, packing soil around a row of newly planted hydrangeas, when I heard the sharp, impatient click of expensive shoes coming up my driveway. Sean stood over my garden, casting a long shadow in his tailored silver suit, looking at my modest single-story house like it was something contagious. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was doing. He simply announced that we needed to go inside, because apparently my neighborhood was ruining his mood. I stood slowly, wiped the dirt from my hands onto an old rag, and led him into the house I had bought 30 years ago to raise his wife in. He stepped into my living room with open disgust, not even bothering to wipe his shoes on the mat. He dropped a thick leather briefcase onto my small coffee table and snapped it open. He pulled out a stack of dense, legal-looking documents and dropped them in front of me, then told me without a hint of politeness to sit down and read. I remained standing. He explained that the $20,000 his father had offered me at the restaurant was only the beginning. He wanted to formalize things. He tapped the stack of papers with one manicured finger and told me it was an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, combined with a full renunciation of rights. I was to legally swear I would never speak of the bribe and officially give up any future claim to financial support tied to Rachel. He wanted me to legally sign away my dignity and my silence in the same breath. I asked him, calmly, what would happen if I refused? Sean stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the wine on his breath, and lowered his voice into something sharp and ugly. He told me he would cut me off from Rachel completely. He said he controlled their finances, their living arrangements, her entire future, and he promised to make sure I never saw my daughter or any grandchildren ever again if I dared defy him. He was talking about my own daughter like she was a business asset he had full ownership of. He was using her, my flesh and blood, as leverage to protect his fragile ego. A younger version of me, the man who built a freight empire with blistered hands and raw stubbornness, might have done something regrettable in that living room. I said nothing. I walked into the kitchen, washed the soil from my hands, dried them slowly, and came back into the living room. Sean snatched the papers off the table the moment my pen lifted. He shoved them back into his briefcase, his chest puffing out with pride. He thought he had bullied a helpless old man into submission. His arrogance completely blinded him to what he had actually just done. He had handed me signed, written proof of his own attempt to extort the majority shareholder of his own company. He had documented his own blackmail in his own handwriting on his own paper. Before he left, he turned around at the door to deliver one final insult. He announced he was hosting a massive corporate merger gala that weekend, the crowning night of his career, and he explicitly forbade me from coming anywhere near it. I told him I understood completely. He sneered, muttered something under his breath, and walked out. I watched from the window as his car sped away down my quiet street. He believed he had permanently erased me from the board. The paperwork was signed, the trap was fully set, and the weekend was coming fast. Then a frantic, desperate knocking rattled my front door. It wasn't Sean's confident, entitled pounding. I opened the door, and my daughter was standing on the porch, soaked to the skin, shivering under a thin coat, her hair plastered to her face. The bright, fiercely independent woman I had raised looked completely broken. She didn't say a single word. She just collapsed against my chest and sobbed. I pulled her inside, locked the door against the cold, wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders, and made her a cup of tea. I didn't ask what happened right away. I already had a fairly good idea who was responsible. Once her hands stopped shaking enough to hold the mug, she told me she'd gone to the grocery store that afternoon and her card had been declined. My hands curled into fists under the table where she couldn't see. He was isolating her financially, stripping away her independence piece by piece to force her into total dependence on him. But that wasn't even the worst part. Sean had come home an hour later with another stack of documents. He wanted her to sign over a private inheritance fund her late mother, Clara, had left specifically for her, a modest life insurance payout from Clara's own parents. Sean told her he needed the money for a bridge loan on a new estate they were supposedly buying in the Hamptons. He called it a formality, a temporary transfer the bank required. When Rachel hesitated and asked to actually read the paperwork first, I sat there staring at my heartbroken daughter as the final piece of Sean's plan clicked into place in my mind. He wasn't buying a house in the Hamptons, he was preparing to disappear. The audit had already shown he was draining the company dry, funneling money to his parents and into offshore accounts. Now I understood the timeline. He knew the merger would create a temporary flood of capital moving through the company, and he planned to use that chaos to siphon out whatever was left before vanishing entirely, taking the stolen millions, the yacht, everything, and abandoning his life in Chicago the moment it was all secured somewhere untouchable. But his greed apparently wasn't satisfied with a company's worth of stolen money. He wanted Clara's inheritance too. He wanted to strip Rachel of her last safety net, drain it into his own accounts, and then file for divorce the second his plane touched down somewhere with no extradition treaty. A cold, lethal calm settled over me. Every fatherly instinct I had wanted to tell her everything, right there at that kitchen table, that I owned the building he worked in, that I held his entire pathetic career in the palm of my hand, that she was heir to an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars and married to a man who was, functionally, already a dead man walking. But I held my tongue. She didn't need a corporate titan sitting across from her in that moment. She needed her father, and more than that, I needed Sean to keep believing for just 2 more days that he was invincible. I reached across the table and took her trembling hands in mine. I told her, in a voice that left absolutely no room for argument. She asked me, voice shaking, what we were going to do. She believed completely that Sean held all the power. I wiped a tear from her cheek and promised her with total certainty that by the end of the weekend he would never be able to hurt her or anyone else ever again. She trusted me. She didn't ask how a retired laborer was supposedly going to defeat a powerful CEO. She simply believed her father had made her a promise, and that was enough for her. I waited until I heard her breathing settle into sleep, and then I walked back to the kitchen and picked up my phone. I called Stephen and told him to move up the timeline. The trap would close at the gala, and it was going to be the most public execution this city had seen in years. I left Rachel sleeping and drove into the financial district before the sun had even cleared the skyline. Stephen was already at his office, a fresh pot of coffee steaming on his desk. "It's time to drop the hammer," I told him. I instructed him to legally exercise the full power of my majority shares and initiate an immediate, total executive freeze across Apex Innovations. As controlling shareholder, I had the unilateral authority to lock the company's financial arteries whenever I chose. I signed my name at the bottom of the page. With one signature, Sean was cut off entirely from the company vault. He simply didn't know it yet. The reaction inside the executive suite, once people started noticing, was immediate and beautifully chaotic. Stephen monitored the internal communications from his terminal. By 9 in the morning, the board was in a state of full panic. I didn't let them breathe. The board, along with the CEO, was required to attend. Sean was about to be forced to host the very meeting that would end him. Stephen drafted the summons carefully, keeping my identity strictly protected under the blind trust's usual legal cover. But corporate maneuvering was only half of this. Firing Sean was a business decision. Sending him to federal prison was something closer to a moral obligation. Stephen picked up his secure line and bypassed local police entirely, contacting the lead investigator at the FI's Financial Crimes Division directly. Stephen coordinated the exact timing. A tactical financial crimes unit would station itself quietly in the hotel's service corridors during the gala, completely out of sight, waiting for a single signal from me. Standing at the window of Stephen's office, looking down at the thousands of people rushing to work below, entirely unaware of the earthquake happening under Apex Innovations, I thought about Sean sitting in his corner office at that exact moment. He believed his tailored suit and fabricated title made him untouchable. He had no idea that real power isn't in a title, or a jacket, or a corner office. Every escape route was closed. The federal agents were briefed. The board was terrified. The stolen money was frozen. All that was left was to wait for Saturday night. Stephen handed me something the next morning that I hadn't asked for, but that turned out to matter more than I expected. A short list of 6 board members, along with his notes on how each of them had reacted, hour by hour, once the freeze hit their inboxes. 2 others had apparently spent the morning trying to reach Sean directly, only to find his assistant telling them he was unavailable, because in truth, Sean had spent that entire morning locked in his office trying to figure out, in a rising panic, exactly how much of his own theft the freeze might expose. He never returned their calls. He was too busy trying to figure out how to save himself. The 6th board member, an older man named Frank Delacroix, who had been with the company since almost the very beginning, sent a message that Stephen showed me with something close to a small smile. Frank had simply written, to the rest of the board, "If the founder is finally back, we should be worried about ourselves, not him." Frank, it turned out, was one of the very few people who had actually met me decades earlier, before I stepped back, and he apparently remembered exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. I kept Patricia and Frank on the new board after everything settled. It was a small detail in the grand scheme of everything that happened that week, but it told me something useful, even inside a company Sean had spent 2 years quietly poisoning. 2 days before the gala, I was standing in aisle 4 of Miller & Sons Hardware, loading 50-pound bags of potting soil onto a metal flatbed cart, wearing my usual faded denim, scuffed boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. They were obviously lost, probably searching for some upscale garden boutique in the neighboring suburb, and had wandered into the wrong parking lot entirely. Howard spotted me almost immediately. His eyes moved over my dirty boots, my faded flannel, the heavy bags on my cart, and a cruel, delighted smile spread across his face. He wanted the cashier, An older gentleman named Arthur, who I'd known for 15 years, to hear every word. Howard let out a loud, theatrical laugh, told me it was fitting to see me, dressed like a vagrant hauling fertilizer, and said it was exactly the kind of pathetic existence I deserved now that his brilliant son was running my company. I stood perfectly still. I didn't clench my fists. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked back at him, thinking about an 80-foot yacht docked in Miami, purchased entirely with stolen money. Cynthia stepped up beside her husband, her perfume cutting through the honest smell of sawdust and motor oil, and told the whole front of the store, with obvious relish, that Sean was about to redefine Apex Innovations that weekend and erase every trace of my outdated blue-collar influence. Howard chuckled, adjusting his sweater, and added that they'd be sure to toast to my miserable retirement from the deck of their new boat. I let every single insult land without a flicker of reaction. I didn't defend my clothes or my life. I let them talk, let them dig their own graves with their own careless, arrogant words, entirely unaware that they were speaking to the man about to end everything they had. Every cruel word reminded me of Rachel shaking at my kitchen table 2 nights earlier, her credit cards frozen, her inheritance under threat from this exact family. I turned back to Arthur, paid for the soil with 3 crisp $100 bills, told him to keep the change and treat his grandchildren to something nice, and pushed my cart out the sliding doors without another word to either of them. The night before the gala, I sat alone at my kitchen table long after midnight, surrounded by the quiet of a sleeping neighborhood. The anger that had burned in my chest all week had mostly burned itself out by then, leaving behind something colder and honestly more dangerous, the calm certainty of a man who had already measured the exact size of his enemy's grave. My phone buzzed. It was Stephen, confirming that the federal snare was fully armed. The lead investigator had personally reviewed our final dossier and found the evidence, the forged invoices, the offshore routing numbers, the shell companies, completely irrefutable. A tactical unit would be in position at the hotel well before the first guest arrived, hidden in the service corridors, the parking garage, the private security rooms, waiting for my signal. For a decade I had been content in faded denim, letting the corporate world quietly forget the man who had built their empire from nothing. I had genuinely believed my battles were over. But Sean and Howard had demanded a war, and they had, without meaning to, called the architect back to the battlefield. I ironed the suit slowly, methodically, the hiss of the steam almost ceremonial. Every memory fed the cold machinery turning in my chest. I turned off the lamp and stood in the dark kitchen for a long moment, looking at the leather portfolio resting on the table. The course was set. This was high society in full performance mode. Politicians, bank executives, industry leaders, all gathered to celebrate what they believed was a triumphant corporate merger. To every single one of them, it looked like a celebration. An hour earlier, I had stood in my own living room, going through the plan one final time with Stephen on a secure line. Federal agents were already in position, invisible to the wealthy crowd below, standing by for a single signal. I had spent that final hour ironing the same midnight blue suit I'd pulled from the closet the night before, and when I finally slipped the heavy wool jacket over my shoulders, the quiet old man from the hardware store and the dinner table simply disappeared. From the balcony, I watched Sean holding court at the center of the ballroom floor, a crystal flute of champagne in his hand, like some kind of royal scepter, surrounded by a tight circle of senior executives and investors. He threw his head back laughing at something, his teeth flashing under the chandelier light. A few yards away, Howard and Cynthia were putting on their own performance. They moved through the crowd like royalty inspecting subjects. Howard slapped a city alderman on the shoulder, leaning in to whisper some invented story about his financial genius, a diamond-studded watch, bought, I knew for a fact, with money diverted from our payroll, catching the light on his wrist. I checked the pocket watch Clara had given me on our 20th anniversary. 3 minutes until the mandatory disclosure meeting I'd forced onto the legal calendar. I turned away from the balcony and started down the sweeping staircase toward the ballroom floor. With every step, 10 years fell away from my shoulders. The heavy wool suit pulled perfectly, demanding a kind of respect that faded denim never could. I reached the bottom of the staircase, crossed the marble foyer, and stood in front of 2 massive mahogany doors separating me from the ballroom. I didn't hesitate. The crash of those doors killed the ambient noise instantly. The string quartet stumbled, the lead violinist dragging her bow across the wrong note before the music simply died. I stepped into the light. I didn't shuffle the way people expect an old man to move. The younger executives and the politicians just looked confused, unsure who this imposing stranger was. But the older board members, the ones who had been with the company since the earliest days, recognized me instantly. I watched the blood drain from the CEO's face. I watched the lead legal counsel take a stumbling step backward, his champagne glass slipping from his fingers and shattering softly against the thick carpet. Whispers spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass. The ghost had returned. The wave of stunned silence finally reached Sean. He stopped mid-sentence, turned with an irritated scowl on his face, annoyed that his audience had suddenly looked away from him, and then his eyes found mine. For a full second, his brain simply refused to process what he was seeing. He recognized the face of the man he had verbally torn apart in his own living room. But the posture, the suit, the sheer weight of authority radiating off me didn't match anything in his understanding of who I was supposed to be. Howard and Cynthia stopped their little procession through the crowd. Cynthia's hand flew to her stolen necklace, her jaw dropping open. They had explicitly forbidden me from coming anywhere near this room. I kept my eyes locked on Sean and walked straight toward the main stage, the heavy leather folder carrying the end of his life tucked firmly under my arm. The crowd parted instinctively as I crossed the marble floor, sensing a shift in the air they couldn't quite name. Howard and Cynthia were standing near a towering ice sculpture. Howard turned, followed her gaze, and his mild irritation twisted instantly into something closer to fury. They abandoned whatever conversation they'd been having with a local politician and marched straight toward me, moving with the kind of frantic, aggressive energy people get when they can feel their carefully built illusion starting to crack. Howard stepped directly into my path, close enough that I could smell the alcohol on his breath. He looked me up and down, and I could see he wasn't even registering the quality of the suit. He only saw the man he had mocked in a hardware store days earlier, the man he believed belonged in the dirt. "How did you get past the front doors?" he hissed. "Did you sneak in through the kitchen like a rat looking for scraps?" Cynthia stepped up beside him, her face flushed red with venom. I didn't blink. I didn't offer a single word in response. I stood there, hands resting lightly on the leather folder, looking at them with the exact amount of significance they had ever actually held in my life. His practiced, easy smile collapsed instantly. He excused himself from the circle of executives, his neck flushing an ugly crimson, and marched across the floor toward us, his leather shoes striking the marble with heavy, angry thuds. He was sweating under the chandelier lights, and it struck me, watching him move, that the confident, untouchable king of Apex Innovations was suddenly terrified of one quiet old man standing in his ballroom. He shoved past a startled group of investors and planted himself directly between his parents and me. His voice dropped into a low, trembling growl. "Have you completely lost your mind?" he snapped. He reminded me aggressively of the papers I'd signed in my own living room days earlier, that I had permanently surrendered every right I had to his family and his company. He was practically vibrating, projecting every ounce of his fear, his guilt, and his arrogance onto me all at once. I let his threats hang in the tense air between us. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice or match his frantic energy. I watched the sweat forming on his forehead. I watched his hand tremble as he jabbed a finger toward my chest. He was unraveling in real time, and he couldn't understand why his threats weren't landing the way they always had. Realizing his words weren't working, Sean's eyes darted around the crowded room, searching for some way to regain control of the narrative. He snapped his fingers sharply in the air, signaling toward the head of corporate security, a broad-shouldered man stationed near the main entrance. He pointed straight at me and ordered the man to remove me from the premises immediately. He didn't bother lowering his voice this time. He wanted the surrounding guests to hear him assert control. He announced loudly that I was a deranged trespasser who had been harassing his family for months and instructed security to drag me outside and call the police. Howard and Cynthia smirked, arms crossed, clearly delighted at the idea of watching me humiliated and dragged out of the building. The head of security began moving toward us. A veteran I had personally approved for hire more than a decade earlier, though he had no idea who I was. Sean leaned toward me, sneering, and told me my pathetic little rebellion was over, that I was about to spend the night in a holding cell. I kept my breathing steady. I didn't step back. The security chief reached us and raised the heavy hand toward my shoulder. It never landed. Before his fingers made contact, a tall, composed figure stepped smoothly out from the shadow of a nearby pillar. "Stephen!" He didn't shout. He didn't run. The security chief froze completely, hands still raised in midair. He recognized Stephen instantly. He lowered his hand slowly, straightened his shoulders, and bowed his head toward me. Not toward Sean, not toward Howard, not toward Cynthia. Stephen didn't wait for the guards to finish retreating. He turned and walked purposefully toward the stage at the far end of the ballroom, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet, the crowd instinctively parting for him the way it does for anyone who clearly belongs somewhere important. He climbed the 3 short steps, approached the sleek silver microphone at center stage, and tapped it twice with his finger. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. The string quartet, still playing softly in the corner, jumped in their seats. The cellist dragged her bow harshly across the strings before the music died completely. Silence dropped over the ballroom like a heavy curtain. Hundreds of conversations stopped in the same instant. Stephen adjusted the microphone and looked out over the crowd. Investors, politicians, executives, all of them waiting. "I'm calling an emergency mandatory shareholder disclosure meeting to order," he said. A ripple of confusion moved through the room. This was supposed to be a celebration, not a corporate proceeding. "The founder," Stephen said, "is standing in this room right now." Sean let out a loud, theatrical scoff that carried clearly through the silent hall. He straightened his tie, puffed out his chest, completely blind to the reality closing in around him. He genuinely believed this was some kind of dramatic surprise, that the mysterious billionaire founder had chosen tonight, of all nights, to publicly bless the merger and validate his leadership in front of everyone who mattered. He scanned the crowd eagerly, searching for a distinguished older face he could charm, already rehearsing the gracious handshake, the modest smile, the press release he'd draft the next morning about being personally endorsed by a legendary business figure. Stephen didn't scan the room. He kept his eyes level, raised his right hand, and pointed a single steady finger directly at me. Every head in the ballroom turned to follow that line, from the stage to where I stood in my midnight blue suit. I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes land on me at once. I didn't rush. I tightened my grip on the leather folder and began walking toward the stage. The crowd parted around me like water. I was no longer the dirty man buying soil at a hardware store. I was no longer the quiet, agreeable father-in-law they could safely ignore. I walked past the terrified faces of vice presidents who had already understood the shift in power. I reached the steps, climbed them, and stepped onto the stage beside Stephen. I looked down at the crowd. Sean was standing in the front row, less than 10 feet away, and the arrogant smile had completely drained from his face, along with most of the color in his skin. He was staring up at the man who had just been revealed to hold absolute power over his entire existence. A few feet away, Howard and Cynthia stood frozen in matching states of horror. They had spent years building a fake dynasty on the back of my quiet labor. They had mistaken my preference for a simple life as proof of weakness. Now the foundation of their entire stolen kingdom was dissolving beneath their feet. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy with the promise of what was coming. I did not raise my voice. I never had to. True power, I have found, doesn't require volume. It requires certainty. I welcomed the board, the shareholders, and the assembled guests to this mandatory disclosure meeting. I told them that for the past decade, I had entrusted the daily running of Apex Innovations to a new generation of leadership, believing in their vision and their integrity. I gave a small nod toward the audiovisual technicians stationed in the glass booth at the back of the room. People Stephen had already secured hours earlier. The massive screens behind me, which had been glowing with the sleek logo of the merger all evening, went black. Then they lit up with something far more illuminating. Enormous, blown-up images of offshore bank statements, corporate ledgers, and shell company registries flooded the screens, the harsh white light of financial documents washing over the shocked faces of the crowd. These were bankers, politicians, seasoned investors. They knew exactly what they were looking at. I watched, one by one, the senior vice presidents physically step away from Sean, as if his corruption might be contagious. Murmurs of disbelief began to ripple and grow through the crowd with every new piece of evidence I put up on the screen. The elite audience that had spent the evening celebrating him was slowly realizing that the man they'd been toasting was, in fact, a highly skilled parasite. The corporate theft was only half of the story. His parents' arrogance deserved its own reckoning. I pressed a button on the podium, and the screen shifted again. An official ownership deed for an 80-foot luxury yacht flashed up, the purchase price circled in bright red. I looked directly at Howard and Cynthia, standing frozen in the middle of the crowd, and spoke clearly into the microphone. "The brilliant lifestyle you've all been admiring tonight," I said, "is a pathetic illusion funded entirely with stolen corporate money. The clothes on their backs, the jewelry, the champagne in your glasses right now. All of it was bought with money stolen from my company." Howard went the color of chalk. The crowd around them parted instantly, leaving Howard and Cynthia standing completely alone in a wide, cold circle of social isolation. The guests who had been drinking champagne with them 10 minutes earlier now looked at their own glasses like the liquid inside had turned to poison. I had exposed their fake wealth and fabricated status to the exact people they had spent years desperately trying to impress. They were not titans of industry. They were common thieves playing dress-up with someone else's money. I wasn't finished. It was a simple list. On one side, the pension fund cuts made across the driver workforce over the past 18 months. On the other side, the executive bonuses approved during that exact same period. While Sean was cutting retirement contributions for the men and women driving trucks across this country in the middle of the night, I said, he was quietly approving six-figure bonuses for himself and two of his closest allies on the executive floor. I want everyone in this room to understand exactly what kind of leadership you've all been applauding tonight. I watched several of the board members lower their eyes. "This is what theft actually costs," I said. "Not just numbers on a balance sheet, years of somebody's life." I closed the folder and looked back out at the crowd. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to spin. Sean couldn't absorb the destruction of his world any longer. Something in him seemed to snap. He reached for the microphone, trying to physically wrestle it away from me, stammering that the documents were fake, that this was all some kind of conspiracy to frame him. He begged the board not to listen to a single word. He sounded, in that moment, like a terrified child caught in a lie too big to talk his way out of, and every trace of his carefully built executive persona fell away in front of the people who mattered most to his career. Stephen took a step forward, ready to intercept him, but I raised a hand and stopped him. I didn't need protection from a man who was already broken. I stood my ground while Sean clawed uselessly at the space between us, tears cutting through the sweat on his face, babbling that he could fix it, that he could return the money, that he just needed one more chance to explain. His frantic excuses broadcast through the microphone to the entire room. He promised to quietly step down if I just turned off the screens and let him leave with whatever dignity he had left. I looked him dead in the eye. Everything else in the room seemed to fade until there was only the small space between us. "Your explanations are worthless," I told him, my voice carrying to the very back of the hall. "Your promises are empty. Your time as the master of the universe is over." I let the words land, and then I said the rest, plainly, without any heat in my voice at all. The words hung in the air, absolute and final. Sean dropped to his knees right there on the stage, sobbing into his hands as the full weight of his ruin finally crushed him. The echo of his termination still hung in the dead silence of the ballroom. The elite crowd stood frozen, holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I turned toward the back of the room and raised my hand. It was a simple, silent signal, the one Stephen and I had planned hours before. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance swung open with a crash loud enough to make several guests jump. A team of federal agents marched into the ballroom in dark tactical gear, the bright yellow letters across their vests unmistakable. Whatever illusion of high society elegance had remained in the room shattered instantly. They moved with total precision, boots striking the marble in a hard, rhythmic beat, and the crowd scattered out of their way like water breaking around rocks. Nobody wanted to be standing anywhere near a federal raid. Down on the floor, the reality of what was happening finally hit Howard. He didn't get far. 2 agents had been quietly stationed at that exact door for over an hour. Cynthia stood frozen near the ice sculpture, watching her husband pinned to a wall and her son held on the stage. A female agent approached her, pulled out a stack of legal warrants and announced, loud enough for the entire silent ballroom to hear, that Howard and Cynthia were under federal investigation for racketeering and receiving stolen corporate funds. Then the agent asked for the necklace. Cynthia let out a raw, guttural sound. Cynthia reached out toward the crowd of wealthy guests she had spent the evening trying to impress, begging someone, anyone, to call her a lawyer. They stared back at her with cold, open disgust. The society she had spent years chasing now looked at her like she was something diseased. The agents marched all 3 of them, Sean, Howard, and Cynthia, toward the main entrance in a slow, humiliating parade. The entire grand ballroom watched in complete silence as the fake aristocratic family was escorted out into the cold night. I stood at the podium, watching the mahogany doors close behind them, and felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as relief. The corporate cancer had finally been cut out. The long, brutal war was over. By the time the sun came up over Chicago the next morning, the story had already broken. Someone at the Gala, probably several someones, had gotten footage of the federal agents leading Sean out in handcuffs, and by 7 a.m., it was running on every local news channel, along with grainy phone video of Cynthia collapsing near the ice sculpture. What surprised me, honestly, wasn't the coverage of Sean. Corporate fraud stories come and go. I had spent 10 years building a quiet life specifically so I wouldn't have to deal with any of this, and I had no intention of trading that piece for a magazine profile now, even a flattering one. Stephen released a single short statement on my behalf, confirming the basic facts of the case and thanking the federal investigators for their work, and nothing more. When reporters kept pushing for a photograph or a personal interview, he simply stopped responding. Eventually, as these things do, the story moved on to something else, the way news always does. I was grateful for that. I had never wanted to be famous. I had only ever wanted to protect my daughter, and now that the danger was gone, I wanted my privacy back just as badly as I'd wanted it. Rachel, for her part, avoided the news entirely for those first few days at my suggestion. There would be time later for her to read every article if she wanted to. The ballroom emptied quickly after that, the terrified guests fleeing through the gilded exits, eager to distance themselves from whatever had just happened. The string quartet had already slipped away. Catering staff moved quietly through the wreckage, clearing half-finished champagne flutes and untouched trays of caviar. The room that had felt like an untouchable fortress of arrogance an hour earlier now looked hollow, almost sad, like a stage after the final curtain. I stood near the edge of the platform, taking a slow breath. The heavy wool suit suddenly felt lighter on my shoulders than it had all night. I scanned the vast, empty floor and found her standing near the back doors. Rachel looked small in that enormous room, dressed simply in a dark dress that stood out sharply against the extravagant gowns everyone else had worn. She was gripping the edge of a velvet-draped table so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and even from a distance I could see her shoulders shaking. She had watched the entire thing unfold from the shadows. She had watched her husband's fraud exposed to the whole city, watched her father revealed as the true owner of the company. I stepped down from the stage and crossed the floor toward her, my shoes echoing softly against the marble. As I got closer, she slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were wide, full of shock and confusion and something that looked almost like awe. She was looking at the tailored suit, the posture, the authority I now carried so openly, and trying to reconcile it with the quiet man who smelled like cedar sawdust and had never once raised his voice at her in her entire life. I stopped a few feet away and opened my arms without saying anything. After a while, she pulled back just enough to look up at me. She was piecing it together in real time. The rushed proposal, the constant isolation, all of it part of a calculated plan. I kept my hands gently on her shoulders, anchoring her. I knew I owed her a real explanation for the years I had spent hiding the truth from her. I told her, true wealth, I told her, is invisible. It isn't diamonds or yachts or imported champagne. It's character, it's integrity. That's what I had wanted for her, more than anything else. I wiped a tear from her cheek and made her a promise. She was free now, completely and permanently. The legal trap was closed. Federal authorities had removed the threat entirely, and neither Sean nor his family would ever cast a shadow over her life again. Her future belonged to her fully for the first time in years. Something shifted in her face as I said it. The fear and betrayal that had lived behind her eyes for months finally lifted, and she began to cry again. 6 months passed, and in that time, the illusion Sean and his parents had built for themselves came apart completely. Sean never got a long, dramatic trial. His expensive defense attorneys looked at the mountain of evidence Stephen's team had assembled and quietly advised him to take a plea deal. The transition broke something in him completely. He traded his bespoke suits for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The man who used to command entire boardrooms with a snap of his fingers now had to ask permission to make a phone call. His days became regulated by alarms and the heavy clang of iron doors. His conviction was the hammer that finally shattered Howard and Cynthia's fragile world. Federal investigators didn't stop with Sean. They followed every dollar directly back to his parents. Howard and Cynthia watched federal agents box up their art, their designer clothes, their stolen jewelry, and haul it away. The financial ruin was bad enough. The social execution was worse, especially for Cynthia. I've learned, operates on a set of rules that are as ruthless as any boardroom. They had no real friends to fall back on, because they had never built anything real. Howard, at 60 years old, with a ruined reputation and no real employable skills beyond decades of performing wealth, was forced to start applying for entry-level jobs. They had spent years looking down on quiet, hard-working people, believing kindness was a weakness to exploit and simplicity was proof of failure. While Sean's sentence was still working its way through the courts, I turned my attention to something just as important, cleaning up what he had left behind inside Apex Innovations itself. A smaller handful had known more than they should have. I asked Valerie, the forensic accountant who had first found the shell companies, whether she would consider coming on permanently to help rebuild our internal financial controls. She said yes almost before I finished the question. Some people, once they've seen how easily a system can be exploited, want nothing more than to be the one who makes sure it never happens again. We brought in a new CO, a woman named Diane Okafor, who had spent 15 years running logistics operations for a competitor and had a reputation in the industry for being almost boringly honest. Within a few months, the culture inside the company had visibly shifted. Employees who had spent 2 years walking on eggshells around Sean's temper started speaking up in meetings again. The drivers I still occasionally visited, the way I had 30 years earlier, told me things felt different. I didn't need to sit behind a desk to know the company was safe again. That was never really the point of coming out of hiding. The point was making sure nobody could ever again walk into that building and treat it, or the people in it, like something they were entitled to steal from. The following spring, on an ordinary morning that felt almost unbelievable in its quietness, I sat on the worn wooden steps of my front porch with a chipped ceramic mug of coffee in both hands. The wood beneath me was old, weathered by decades of changing seasons and the scrape of my boots. The first pale light of dawn was just beginning to spread across the horizon, painting the quiet street in soft blues and grays. Across the road, Mrs. Gable was out walking her golden retriever in a thick wool coat. A newspaper delivery truck rolled slowly around the corner. The screen door creaked behind me. Rachel stepped out in an oversized sweater, holding her own mug of coffee. She didn't say anything. She just walked down and sat beside me, pulling her knees up to her chest the way she used to as a little girl. I looked at her out of the corner of my eye. The dark circles that had shadowed her eyes for months were gone. The tension that used to live permanently in her shoulders had faded away completely. We sat there together in the cool morning air, watching the streets slowly wake up, and we didn't feel any need to fill the silence with small talk. The quiet between us wasn't heavy with secrets anymore. It was comfortable. She had moved back into her old childhood bedroom after the gala and had stayed for the better part of the following months. Back at Apex Innovations, the culture Sean had poisoned had been fully replaced. Diane was running the company with a steady, practical hand, and profits that used to disappear into offshore shell companies were now going back into the business, into equipment, into wages, into the people who actually did the work. I had made sure, through layers of legal structure that would have taken Sean a lifetime to unravel even if he tried, that Rachel would be protected for the rest of her life without the money ever defining her or attracting another predator looking for an easy target. It would simply sit there in the background. She was working part-time now at a local community center, finding a kind of quiet purpose that had nothing to do with a husband's title or a family name. The sun finally cleared the horizon, spilling gold and orange light across the lawns, catching in the dew on the grass like scattered light on water. A breeze moved through the old oak tree in the front yard. The war was over. It already felt like a distant memory. The people who had once tried to manipulate and erase my family were now living out the consequences of their own choices, one in a federal cell, two more in a cold apartment on the far edge of the city, learning, very late, exactly what it cost to build a life on lies. But here, on this worn wooden porch, there was only peace. Order had been restored. The greatest victory hadn't been destroying the people who tried to hurt us, or reclaiming a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The greatest victory was simply this: sitting on an old porch, drinking bad coffee, watching the sunrise beside the person I loved most in the world. I didn't need a tailored suit or a room full of terrified executives to know my own worth. The founder of Apex Innovations was perfectly, completely content wearing a faded flannel shirt and holding a chipped mug. I closed my eyes and let the morning sun warm my face, and I understood with total clarity 2 years is a strange amount of time. It's long enough for wounds to close, but not so long that you forget exactly how deep they were. By the time 2 years had passed since that night in the ballroom, our lives had settled into something I hadn't dared to hope for back when Rachel first showed up shivering on my porch. Rachel had moved into her own apartment about a year after the gala, a modest one. Bedroom place close enough to the community center where she worked that she could walk there most mornings. She had gone back to school part-time, working toward a degree in social work, something she'd talked about wanting to do years earlier before Sean had convinced her, gently and persistently, that it wasn't a practical use of her time. She started seeing someone eventually, not right away, and not because I or anyone else pushed her toward it. It happened slowly, the way these things are supposed to happen. His name was Daniel, and he taught middle school science 2 blocks from the community center. He didn't ask me a single question about my work. He asked about my garden. He asked what kind of soil worked best for hydrangeas in Chicago winters, and he actually listened to the answer, taking out his phone at one point to write down a note. When Rachel got up to get more coffee, he leaned over and quietly told me that she talked about me constantly, and that he hoped someday he could earn even half the trust she clearly had in me. I didn't tell him who I really was, not that night. I like Daniel, I still do. Apex Innovations, meanwhile, had grown into something I was genuinely proud of again. Not just profitable, though it was that too, but honest in a way it hadn't been in years, maybe not since I'd stepped back a decade earlier. Marcus Delgado retired the following spring, on the exact timeline he and his wife had originally planned before Sean's cuts pushed it back. People sometimes assume, when they hear a story like this one, that the satisfying part is the moment of exposure. The screens lighting up, the handcuffs, the gasps from the crowd. The gala mattered. But the real work, the work that actually changed anything for the better, happened in the months and years that came after, in all the small, unglamorous decisions nobody was watching. About a year into his sentence, I received a letter. Stephen brought it to me personally, still sealed, because the prison had forwarded it through Apex Innovations' legal department, the only address Sean apparently still had for me. I want to tell you, I threw it away without reading it. I didn't. I sat at my kitchen table one evening, turned it over in my hands for a long while, and eventually opened it. It wasn't what I expected. I had braced myself for excuses, for manipulation, for one more attempt to talk his way out of consequences he could no longer escape. Instead, the letter was short, almost plain. He wrote that he had a lot of time to think in there, more than he'd ever had in his entire life, and that most of what he'd thought about was how badly he had misjudged who I was, not just my wealth, but the fact that he had looked at a quiet man who chose simplicity and assumed that meant weakness, when it had actually meant the opposite the entire time. He wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, and that he wasn't asking for any. I don't know how much of that letter was genuine reflection, and how much was simply the natural result of a man with nowhere left to perform for. Prison has a way of stripping away an audience, and without an audience, some people discover they don't actually know who they are underneath the performance. I showed the letter to Rachel eventually, and left the decision about what to do with it entirely up to her. She read it twice, folded it carefully, and told me she wasn't ready to respond, maybe not ever, but that she was glad I hadn't hidden it from her. That felt like the right way to handle it. I had spent years making decisions on her behalf, for reasons I believe were good ones at the time. I didn't want to keep doing that now that she was finally standing on her own 2 feet again. I never wrote back to Sean myself. Some bridges, once burned, are better left as ash. But I didn't feel the need to hate him anymore either. Hate. Howard and Cynthia's marriage did not survive their fall from grace, though it took almost 2 years. Cynthia eventually found work at a retail store in a strip mall, not far from their apartment, folding clothes and running a register for slightly above minimum wage. Howard never did find steady work. He drifted between a few short-lived jobs, a security guard position he lost after 3 months, a delivery driver job that lasted even less time than that. They finally separated a little over 2 years after the gala. Cynthia moved into a smaller apartment across town, on her own for the first time since she was in her 20s. I heard, through the same secondhand channel, that she had actually started doing better once she was living alone. That something about not having Howard's resentment in the room with her every evening had let her focus, finally, on just getting through each day without the added weight of a collapsing marriage on top of everything else. Howard, as far as I know, still lives in that same cold apartment. I don't know much more than that, and I've made a point not to go looking for more. There's a difference between wanting someone to face fair consequences for what they did and wanting to spend the rest of your life monitoring their misery. I want to spend a little more time on Rachel because, in a lot of ways, she's the real center of this whole story, even though I spent most of it talking about boardrooms and bank accounts. The community center where she worked served mostly low-income families on the west side of the city, after-school programs for kids whose parents worked two jobs, a small food pantry, occasional financial literacy classes for adults trying to climb out of debt they hadn't fully chosen for themselves. Daniel proposed to her about 3 years after the gala, on a Tuesday evening in the community center's small courtyard garden after the kids had gone home for the day. Not some grand, expensive spectacle, just the two of them and a ring he'd saved up for carefully over several months. I walked her down the aisle a year after that at a small outdoor ceremony that cost a fraction of what her first wedding had and meant infinitely more. Standing there, watching her laugh with her new husband under a simple string of lights, I thought about Clara and about that first wedding in her parents' backyard, decades earlier, under paper lanterns her mother had made by hand. People sometimes ask me, even now, why I still wear the same faded flannel shirts, still drive that same old pickup truck into town, still spend my Saturday mornings at Miller & Sons Hardware buying soil for a garden I could easily pay someone else to maintain. I understand the question. From the outside, it probably looks like some kind of eccentric performance, an old billionaire playing dress-up as a simple man for the cameras that never show up. The truth is much less interesting than that, and much more honest. I wear the flannel shirts because they're comfortable and because I've always found something deeply satisfying about working with my hands, whether that means loading bags of soil onto a cart or, decades ago, loading freight onto a truck at 4 in the morning. I drive the old pickup because it still runs, and I've never seen the point in replacing something that still does its job well, whether that something is a truck or a friendship or a marriage. I garden because it's quiet and because watching something grow slowly, patiently, over a full season taught me most of what I know about running a company and raising a daughter, long before I ever sat in a boardroom. Arthur, the cashier at the hardware store, retired about a year after that day Howard and Cynthia humiliated me in front of him. I still see Howard occasionally, from a distance, in the parts of the city where our paths sometimes cross without either of us intending them to. We've never spoken since that night in the ballroom. There's nothing left to say. I should tell you something I haven't mentioned yet because I think it matters for understanding why I reacted to Sean and his parents the way I did, with such calm, deliberate patience instead of immediate anger. Sean and Howard were not the first people to look at my simple life and assume it meant I was an easy target. Over the decades, it happened more times than I can easily count. Business partners who tried to renegotiate contracts the moment they learned I preferred handshake deals over expensive lawyers. Every single time, the pattern was the same. I'm not saying every quiet person you meet is secretly a billionaire. Stephen finally retired about 4 years after the gala at the age of 70, handing the day-to-day legal management of the trust over to a younger attorney he had personally trained for nearly a decade in preparation for exactly this transition. I threw him a small dinner at my house to mark the occasion. Nothing extravagant, just Rachel, Daniel, Stephen's wife of 41 years. Over coffee, Stephen told a story I'd never heard before, even after 35 years of working together. He said that back in our very first case, the one where I couldn't afford real representation, he changed his mind, he told me after our first phone call when I had asked him, almost as an afterthought, at the very end of the conversation, whether he'd eaten dinner yet that evening. I don't fully remember asking that question, honestly. It sounds like something I would have said, though, especially back then when I was still raising a toddler alone and thinking constantly about whether everyone around me had eaten enough that day, because I so often hadn't managed to feed myself properly during those exhausting years. Stephen said that small moment told him everything he needed to know about the kind of client. We sat at that table for a long time after dinner, two old men talking about 4 decades of decisions, contracts, and quiet loyalty that had somehow turned into one of the most important relationships of either of our lives. Rachel and Daniel had their first child about 5 years after the gala, a girl they named Clara, after her grandmother, a decision Rachel made without any hesitation and told me about with tears already gathering in her eyes before she'd even finished the sentence. I remember holding my granddaughter for the first time in the hospital room, this small, impossibly light bundle of blankets and quiet breathing, and feeling something crack open in my chest that I hadn't fully expected. I had spent so many years protecting Rachel, fighting for her, worrying about her, that I hadn't fully prepared myself for the strange, overwhelming feeling of getting to start that whole process over again, except this time from a place of complete peace instead of desperate survival. Little Clara grew up knowing me as the grandfather who always smelled faintly of cedar sawdust and garden soil, who kept a coffee can full of odd nuts and bolts on his porch for her to sort through when she visited, who taught her slowly and patiently exactly how deep to plant a hydrangea bulb so it would survive a Chicago winter. I told her the truth eventually when she was old enough to understand it properly, sitting on that same porch where her mother and I had watched so many sunrises together. I explained it to her the same way I once explained it to Rachel, that real wealth isn't loud, that the people who need to announce their worth to a room are usually the ones with the least of it underneath the performance, and that I hoped, more than almost anything else in the world, that she would grow up valuing the quiet things, the honest things, the honest things, the honest things, the undisappear the moment the money runs out. I think often, especially now in the quieter years of my life, about the exact moment everything in this story turned. I could have made a scene right there. I could have stood up. That's a heavier lesson than it sounds like on the surface. And it's one I don't think I could have taught Rachel with words alone. She needed to see it. Even now, years later, there's one meeting each quarter I still attend in person, even though Diane and Stephen's successor could easily run everything without me sitting in the room. I sit at the back of the room for that meeting, usually in the same faded flannel shirt I'd wear to the hardware store, and I listen. I ask questions when something looks off. Diane once asked me, half joking, why I bothered showing up to what she called the most boring meeting on the calendar when I could easily delegate it entirely. I told her the truth. It's not the most boring meeting on the calendar. It's the most important one. Everything else the company does, the mergers, the expansion, the shiny quarterly earnings calls, means nothing if the people actually doing the physical work of moving freight across this country aren't being treated fairly. I learned that lesson decades ago, sleeping in a truck cab with my daughter beside me, and I never intend to forget it again, no matter how large the company gets or how far removed from the loading dock my own daily life has become. That meeting, more than any boardroom battle or dramatic confrontation, I want to say something here about Arthur. Arthur worked behind that register for over 20 years, long enough to watch 3 generations of families in that neighborhood grow up, move away, and sometimes come back with their own kids in tow. When Howard and Cynthia stood in that store and humiliated me in front of him, Arthur didn't say a word in my defense, and I never expected him to. After everything happened, after the arrests, after the story broke across every local news channel, Arthur never once brought it up to me directly. Whenever I do end up telling this story to someone new, a rare occurrence since I still prefer my privacy, it's a fair question, and I've thought about it more than I probably should. If I had told Sean who I really was from the very beginning, I never would have learned who he actually was underneath the performance. Instead, because I stayed quiet, Sean showed us exactly who he was without any filter, without any performance. I would rather have that truth, painful as it was to watch unfold, than a comfortable lie that let Sean hide his real character behind my money for years longer than he actually did. Rachel needed to see him clearly, on her own, without my wealth clouding the picture. I still sit on that same porch most mornings, even now, years after everything in this story took place. The wood has been replaced twice since Rachel was a little girl, board by board, as the old pieces finally wore through. Little Clara visits most weekends now. Old enough to help me in the garden without needing constant supervision, young enough to still ask questions about absolutely everything, the way children do before the world teaches them to stop wondering out loud. I would tell him that the instinct he had even then, to treat every driver fairly, to pay every vendor on time, to build his reputation on honesty rather than aggression, was going to matter more than he could possibly understand at the time. I would also tell him gently that it was going to be all right to slow down eventually. I've come to think of Apex Innovations differently now than I did even 10 years ago, back when I first stepped away and handed the reins to a board that had no idea who I really was. It isn't really a monument to me at all. It's a structure, a system, built to outlast any single person sitting at the top of it, including me. I've made sure, through every legal structure Stephen and his successor have built into the trust, that no single person will ever again be able to quietly bleed this company dry the way Sean did. There are checks now that didn't exist before, oversight committees with real teeth, an independent auditing relationship with Valerie's old firm that reviews the books twice a year, completely separate from anyone on the internal finance team. I build those safeguards not because I expect another Sean to come along anytime soon, but because I learned the hard way that arrogance and greed have an unfortunate way of finding whatever gaps you've left unguarded, no matter how unlikely it seems at the time. Someday this company will belong to Rachel, and eventually, I imagine, to little Clara after her. I've made sure the legal groundwork is already in place to protect them both from exactly the kind of predator that nearly destroyed Rachel's life once already. I hope, honestly, they never need to use any of it. But hope was never a strategy I could afford to rely on alone, not after everything I've seen and not after everything this family has already survived. I've spent a good part of my life around genuinely wealthy people, and I've noticed something over the decades that I think is worth sharing, because I don't believe enough people talk about it honestly. There are two very different kinds of rich people in this world, and they are almost never the same kind of person, even when their bank accounts look identical on paper. There's the kind of rich that needs to be seen. The watches, the yachts, the loud restaurant reservations, the constant, exhausting performance of success for an audience that deep down, most of these people don't even particularly respect or trust. Howard and Cynthia were this kind of rich, even before we discovered their money wasn't actually theirs at all. I don't say any of this to claim moral superiority over people who genuinely enjoy nice things. There is nothing wrong, in itself, with enjoying a good meal or a comfortable car or a beautiful house, if you can afford it honestly, and it brings you real, uncomplicated joy. Real security, the kind that can't be taken away by a bad year or a market downturn or, in their case, a federal investigation, comes from somewhere else entirely. It comes from knowing exactly who you are with or without an audience watching, and building a life you'd still be proud of even if nobody else ever found out the details. I want to close this part of the story with something small, something I've never fully told anyone else, not even Stephen. After Rachel and I finally left that emptied ballroom the night of the gala, walking together out into the cold Chicago air, she stopped on the sidewalk, still wrapped in my jacket, and asked me one more question before we got into the car. She asked whether I had ever, in 3 years of watching Sean treat me with quiet contempt, wanted to simply tell him the truth just to make him stop. I told her the truth. Yes, more times than I could easily count. There were dinners, family gatherings, small moments of casual cruelty over the years where the temptation to simply announce exactly who I was and watch his face change instantly from disdain to desperate flattery had been almost overwhelming. It would have been so easy. I told her I hadn't done it, in the end, for 2 reasons. The first was that I wanted her to be loved for herself, without my money ever entering the equation, and revealing the truth early would have made that impossible to ever fully know for certain. I told her I was sorry that answer had cost her 3 years of pain to arrive at. She was quiet for a long moment, watching her breath fog in the cold air, and then she told me something I've carried with me ever since. She said she wasn't angry with me anymore, and that somewhere underneath the pain of the last 3 years, I think about that sentence often, on quiet mornings on the porch, more than almost anything else that happened during that entire ordeal. It told me, more clearly than any dramatic courtroom victory ever could, that despite everything Sean had tried to take from her, my daughter's judgment, her clarity, her fundamental strength of character, had survived completely intact. That, in the end, was always the only outcome that actually mattered to me. I think it's worth mentioning before I close this story that this wasn't actually the first time in my life I had lost nearly everything. It was simply the first time I had ever chosen, deliberately, to fight back on such a large and public scale. When Clara died, I lost, in the space of a few short months, the only partner I had ever loved, most of our small savings, and very nearly my own will to keep going at all. That early loss taught me something Sean and his parents never had the chance to learn, because they had never actually built anything real from scratch in their entire lives. It taught me that true resilience isn't about avoiding hardship. I don't say this to boast about my own resilience. I say it because I think it's the actual key to understanding everything that happened in this story. The people who build something real, slowly, honestly, out of genuine hardship, tend to develop a kind of quiet strength that can't be taken away, even when the money eventually is. I still have that original white envelope, the one Howard slid across the dinner table all those years ago. I keep it now in a drawer in my kitchen, tucked behind some old photographs and a few of Rachel's childhood report cards. I take it out occasionally, on quiet evenings, and look at it for a while, not out of anger anymore. That faded a long time ago, somewhere between the Gala and Clara's 2nd birthday. Not everyone in Rachel's position gets a father with a hidden fortune waiting quietly in the wings. I think about that often, and it's part of why I've stayed involved, in small and mostly anonymous ways, with organizations that help people navigate financial abuse and manipulation within their own families and marriages, the kind of quiet, insidious control Sean exercised over Rachel's bank accounts long before any of us fully understood what he was actually doing. That envelope sitting quietly in my kitchen drawer reminds me every time I see it exactly how much luck was involved in how this particular story turned out, alongside all the patience and planning. I want to include one more conversation before I close this out, because it happened relatively recently and it stayed with me since. Diane, still running Apex Innovations with the same steady hand she'd brought to the job from her very first day, she told me she'd been approached by a reporter working on a longer feature about corporate fraud recovery stories, and that the reporter specifically wanted to interview the mysterious founder who had supposedly returned from a decade of anonymity to personally dismantle a fraud scheme at a live company gala. I thought about it for longer than I expected to. Part of me understood the appeal. I did, eventually, agree to let Diane share a version of the story internally, anonymized just enough, as part of the company's new employee training on financial ethics and fraud prevention. I'll end where I so often find myself these days, sitting on that same porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun come up over a street that has changed only slightly in all the years I've lived on it. I think sometimes about how easily this story could have gone differently. None of it was guaranteed. Wealth alone never protects anyone, not really. I've watched plenty of wealthy families destroy themselves through exactly the same arrogance that eventually destroyed Howard and Cynthia. What actually protected my family, in the end, wasn't the money sitting quietly in that blind trust. It was patience and loyalty and the quiet, unglamorous discipline of doing the right thing carefully, even when doing it loudly and immediately would have felt so much more satisfying in the moment. I finish my coffee most mornings the same way I always have, slowly, watching the light change, grateful in a way I don't think I could have fully appreciated before everything that happened. Before I close this story completely, I want to speak directly, for a moment, to anyone listening who might recognize a piece of themselves in it. Maybe you're not sitting on a hidden fortune. Maybe there's no blind trust waiting quietly in the wings to rescue you the moment things go wrong. And if you are the one right now, looking down on someone because their life looks simpler than yours, because their clothes are a little more worn, because their car is a little older than the one in your own driveway, I hope this story gives you a moment of real pause. You very rarely know, from the outside, exactly what someone else has built, survived, or is quietly capable of. A few months ago, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, I drove out to one of our oldest distribution centers, the same warehouse where I used to balance the books by hand at a folding table, decades before any of this story began. I walked the floor slowly that afternoon, nodding to drivers loading trucks, most of whom had no idea who I actually was beyond an older man in a flannel shirt who occasionally wandered through, chatting with the dock supervisor about scheduling and asking after his kids. I stopped near the same corner of the warehouse where, all those years ago, I used to sit with a stack of invoices and a cheap calculator, doing math by hand because I couldn't yet afford proper accounting software. I thought, too, about Sean, still sitting in a federal facility somewhere, working his small manufacturing job for a wage that would have embarrassed him a decade earlier, and about Howard and Cynthia, still separately rebuilding lives neither of them ever expected to need to build from scratch. There's one more thing I think is worth saying before I finally let this story rest. People sometimes assume that the years I spent staying quiet, refusing to correct Sean's assumptions, refusing to tell Rachel the full truth about our family's resources, refusing to defend myself at that first humiliating dinner, must have been miserable. That's not quite how it felt from the inside. Silence, chosen deliberately and for good reasons, is a very different thing from silence forced on you by fear or powerlessness. I think that's an important distinction for anyone listening who might be sitting quietly through their own difficult situation right now, waiting for the right moment to act. There's a real difference between silence that comes from having no options and silence that comes from choosing deliberately to wait until your options are fully ready. The first kind of silence can wear a person down over time, hollow them out slowly from the inside. The second kind, the kind I practiced for those 3 years, can actually feel something closer to strength, even when it looks, from the outside, exactly like weakness. I don't say this to suggest that patience is always the right answer, in every situation, for every person. There's a photograph on the mantel in my living room, the same worn brick fireplace Sean once looked at with such open contempt during his visit to demand I sign away my dignity. I've kept that photograph in the exact same spot on that mantle for over 30 years now. Through every renovation, every change in furniture, that picture was taken during the hardest years of my life, right in the middle of the exhausting stretch between Clara's death and the moment the business finally started to feel stable instead of desperate. I think about that photograph often, especially now, sitting on the porch some mornings with my granddaughter nearby, sorting through a coffee can of odd nuts and bolts, the same way her mother once did at that same age. That's the story underneath this whole story. If you strip away the boardrooms and the federal agents and the dramatic reveal on a hotel stage. I started this habit decades ago, back when the notebook also had to hold the actual numbers. Every story needs a place to stop, even when the life underneath it just keeps going. So I'll leave you here instead, on that porch, with the coffee going cold in a chipped mug, watching the sun finish its slow climb over an ordinary street in an ordinary neighborhood, in a house that has never once needed to be bigger than it already is. Somewhere inside, a granddaughter is probably drawing on the kitchen table. Somewhere across town, a daughter is building the kind of honest, steady life she was always capable of building, once the right people finally got out of her way. And somewhere, quietly, in a drawer behind some old photographs, an uncashed check for $20,000 still sits, a small permanent reminder of exactly how close arrogance came to costing this family everything, and exactly how far patience, in the end, was able to carry it instead. That's the whole story. Thank you for staying with it all the way to the end. Before the final lesson, one more small note for anyone still listening this deep into the story. If there's one thing I hope you take away from everything you've just heard, it's this. True value was never something that could be measured by a bank balance, a designer label, or a seat at the right table. Wealth, when it's turned into a weapon of arrogance, always ends up destroying the very people who wield it. Real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need a gold watch or a diamond necklace or a yacht docked in Miami to prove it exists. Real power lives in quiet integrity. It lives in the patience to wait for the right moment instead of the satisfying moment. It lives in the willingness to protect the people you love from manipulation, even when protecting them means carrying a heavy secret alone for years without any recognition or thanks. We should never confuse a polished exterior with an honest heart, and we should never, ever mistake someone's kindness or their simplicity or their quiet nature for weakness. The old man in the faded jacket buying soil at a hardware store might be exactly who he appears to be. In the end, the strongest foundation any family can build isn't made of money at all. It's made of honesty, love given freely, without hidden agendas, without secret calculations, without anyone waiting quietly in the wings to extract something in return. Sean and his parents built their entire lives on the opposite of that foundation, and when the truth finally caught up with them, there was nothing solid left underneath to catch their fall. I hope, whatever table you find yourself sitting at tonight, that you remember exactly how much more durable quiet integrity turns out to be than loud arrogance ever could. It doesn't always look impressive in the moment, but given enough time, it is very often the only thing left standing when everything else has finally been stripped away. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think, even for a moment, about the people in your own life who deserve more credit than they've been given, or about the quiet strength it takes to wait for the right moment instead of the easy one, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and if you believe the way I do, that arrogance always eventually comes with a bill attached, go ahead and hit that like button and consider subscribing for more stories like this one. Thank you for staying with me through this whole journey. I'll see you in the next one.